The English rock band UFO was a major force in the transition to Britain's explosion of heavier acts, collectively known as the new wave of British heavy metal, especially when you consider that their most notable lead guitarist was worshipped by many players in metal for decades to come. So let's go into depth on that and more as we explore UFO. So this is usually where I go into my personal history with the band, but to be honest, I have none. I've never bought a UFO album in my life and only really knew about their famous guitarist through his time in the Scorpions and in his solo efforts in the 1980s. In fact, here's the Scorpions album he's on. This is Love Drive from 1979. Also, the Michael Schenker albums I own include the Michael Schenker Group from 1980, MSG from 1981, Built to Destroy from 1983, and Rock Will Never Die from 1984. Which definitely seems like a good point to do a brief history of the band. They were formed in 1968 in London, England, featuring vocalist Phil Mogg, guitarist Bernie Marsden, and bassist Pete Way. The first couple of albums were more concentrated on earlier rock sounds and didn't chart well, let alone get really noticed by British or American audiences. Their career really didn't launch until June of 1973 when they recruited Michael Schenker from the Scorpions and released their Phenomenon album the following year. More on that guitar work later, to be sure. The band went through a number of lineup changes through the years with only Mogg as the consistent member. Pete Way, of course, went on to form Fastway, then later Wasted. And Bernie Marsden went on to co-found Whitesnake with David Coverdale. Of course, as mentioned before, Michael Schenker went on to do a solo career, one that continues to this very day. And in April of 2024, Mogg announced the third and likely final disbandment of UFO. So I've got 8 studio albums to discuss, followed by my conclusions and a bit of a wrap-up. I do know the band started putting out albums in 1970, but I'm only going to cover the releases during their popular period between 1974 to 1982, specifically albums that charted well and were mostly certified, which will basically keep things focused. So with that, let's begin. Starting with their third studio album released in May of 1974 by Chrysalis Records, this is Phenomenon. So, despite their walking away from the specifically blues-based rock of they were doing in the past, the opening track Too Young to Know still maintains a vibe of that, but in general we get a slower-paced, dreamy rocker with some groove soloing throughout. It's a relatively mellow track to open a rock record with, but also has a strong chorus that holds it together, and definitely some Bowie influence in there. After that, we dip into acoustic ballad territory with Crystal Light, again front-loading the record with more languid material. Of course, the pace picks up for Dr. Doctor, which might have been a more interesting album opener instead. A nice slow chug and some cool vocal harmonies here and there. Also, Schenker's guitar work, both riff and solo, really start to shine here. In particular, his pick slide accents and Queen-esque flourishes really add to the track. After this, we're back to another ballad with Space Child with a slow groove and nice interplay between acoustic and electric guitar, also with some faint hints of the hippier end of early Sabbath and maybe some mellow-ended Pink Floyd mixed in as well. After this, the pace picks up once again with Rock Bottom, which is definitely my favorite track on the record, and gives you an early window into what so many of the new wave of British heavy metal bands would do later on. Very heavy guitar tone here, somewhere between Sabbath and Maiden. Great way to end side 1 of the record. Flipping over to side 2, we get Oh My. It's a simple rocker with a slightly bluesy flavor, similar in tone and delivery to Too Young to Know, but with some slightly more interesting solo meanderings throughout. After this is the third ballad on the record, Time on My Hands, with lots of strumming acoustic guitar and bass accents, not to mention some really sweet, moody soloing. A pinch of Zeppelin in here as well. After this is Built for Comfort, a steady but slower 12-bar blues rocker with weeping solos that would get along well with similar tracks from early AC/DC. Next we move on to another ballad of sorts, this one drenched in a bit of southern charm called Lipstick Traces. It's an instrumental and showcases Schenker's moodier side of soloing. There are some moments where I'm getting shades of Ritchie Blackmore, but not excessively. Album ends with Queen of the Deep, and it begins with a ballad this time with lyrics, but soon brings in a bit more rock with power chords and wandering solo work. Really love the riff in between verses and the closeout riff in particular. A satisfying way to close out the record. Favorites on this one are Dr. Doctor, of course, Rock Bottom, and Queen of the Deep. As for charting, it reached 202 in the US, 76 in Australia. Also, no certifications. And also, Give Her the Gun and Dr. Doctor were the singles. Production on the album was handled by Leo Lyons, who was the bassist for 10 Years After. Also, it was recorded at Morgan Studios in London, England between 1973 and 1974. Artwork, as some of you might already know or can simply guess, is from the art design group known as Hypnosis, who also did a number of covers for the Scorpions, so there's another Schenker connection there for you. As for cover tunes, Iron Maiden covered Dr. Doctor on the B-side of their Lord of the Flies single in 1995. Also, Agent Steel covered the song on the Spaced Out, a UFO tribute compilation album in 2004. And Jenny Lane of Warrant also covered it on the Lights Out, the Ultimate Tribute to UFO compilation album in 2007. Also, Joey Belladonna's classic rock solo band has been covering that song live in 2025. The song Rock Bottom was covered by Joe Lynn Turner on the Undercover 2 album in 1999. Steve Grimmett also covered Rock Bottom on the Only UFO Can Rock Me, a tribute to UFO compilation album in 2001. And Phil Lewis of LA Guns covered the track on the Lights Out, the Ultimate Tribute to UFO compilation. So, a decently balanced record, though a little heavy with ballad material for my liking. Love both Dr. Doctor as well as the amazing Rock Bottom, and hoping they double down on the heavier side of things on the releases to follow. Next is their fourth studio album, released in July of 1975 by Chrysalis Records. This is Force It. So album opens with Let It Roll, with guitar feedback sliding quickly into a gallop riff and some more energetic vocals from Moog than those on the previous album. A nice segment happens later on where it drops down to harmonic and moody solo work, and this is where I can really sense the importance of Schenker in this band and how focused so many of the songs are on him specifically. Obviously, no blame there. After the mellow bit, power chords and wailing solos come in and then later rejoin the main riff. Next is Shoot Shoot with a pulsating beat riff combo and soulful vocals, but at a solid driving pace. Main riff has an almost Nazareth boogie to it. After that, we get an acoustic ballad in the form of High Flyer with some great vocal harmonies. Next is Love Lost Love, and straight from following a ballad, it simply bursts forth with an aggressive riff and gruff but melodic vocal lines. The power chord runs during the choruses are especially effective. Also noticing that Schenker plays with varying guitar tones from track to track in his rhythm playing. This one has a harsher bite to it for sure. Next is Out in the Street, which starts slow with keys and soulful singing, then with intermittent power chords, and then follows a rapid and heavy boogie riff, then repeats the same mellow, then hard pattern for the second verse. Piano runs during the bridge are a nice touch as well. Jumping over to side 2, we get Mother Mary, a total rocker with hard chords, wailing solo flourishes, and some cool groove throughout. Great way to bring us back from side 1 of the record. Next is Too Much of Nothing, which opens with ominous power chords, but brightens up a bit soon enough, and then a bit of the back and forth with these two moods. Really digging the bass runs throughout in this one, not to mention the mournful fretwork and the eerie breakdown about mid-track. After that, we get a bit of a funky stomper with Dance Your Life Away, also bringing in some swingy vocals and playful guitar passages. The album ends with This Kid's slash Between the Walls, and it truly doubles down on the boogie riffing and some almost crooner rock vocals, but also has a solid mid-pace with added keys for flourish and off-kilter riffing, not entirely dissimilar from some of Jimmy Page's stuff in Zeppelin at times. The latter half of the track gets pretty spacey, closing the record out with a bit of mood and reflection. Favorites are Let It Roll, Shoot Shoot, and Mother Mary. As for charting, it reached 71 in the US and 35 in Germany. Also, no certifications. And also, Shoot Shoot was the only single. And no, not the same song Dio did on Sacred Heart. Also, let's talk about that cover art, also by Hypnosis, but it's the cover image that garners the most attention. There was a censored version of it with the two folks making out, and the bottom nudity in particular is obscured, notably for the US release. But let's talk about who those folks are on the cover. The lady is Cozy Fanny Tootie of Throbbing Gristle fame, but the other person is none other than the late Genesis Peorage, also one-time member of Throbbing Gristle, but later of various projects including the Temple of Psychic Youth. You might also notice all the water faucets in the shot. That's a play on the album title, so faucet, forcet, get it? And there is a connection with both Throbbing Gristle and Hypnosis, as Peter Christopherson was a member of both, and later a director of music videos for such acts as Rage Against the Machine and Sepultura, among many others. As for cover tunes, Paul Di'Anno covered Shoot Shoot on the Only UFO Can Rock You, a tribute to UFO compilation album from 2001. Saxon also covered the song on their Paint It Black single in 2021. I should also mention that Forcet was the album that ex-Merciful Fate guitarist Michael Denner claims as the biggest inspiration for his playing. So, a much heavier album overall from Phenomenon, but also some more diverse playing from Schenker, including many more guitar tone shifts. As I wanted, this band is steering more into a direction that I'm digging quite a bit more and hopeful for what comes next. Next up is their fifth studio album, released in May of 1976 by Chrysalis Records. This is No Heavy Petting. So driving chords and snare lead us into the opening track, Natural Thing, an upbeat number with pulsating piano keys in the choruses, as well as mid-range rocking vocals with a touch of rasp. A bit of the blues as well, notably in the solos. After this is I'm a Loser. It's a mellow acoustic stomper with slide guitar, heavying up in the choruses with strumming electric chords and stronger vocals, then back and forth through the two styles. Guitar solo in this one rips quite a bit as well. Next is Can You Roll Her, with synth quickly leading to up-tempo guitar riffing and equally up-tempo drum beat. A lot of good energy in this track and some cool riffs throughout. You can also hear why this was the single. After that is Belladonna, starting with a pretty acoustic melody with accenting bass and mournful vocals, bringing in simultaneous keyboard styles underneath. Definitely a ballad, but a highly effective one with a sentimental solo to match. Next is Reasons Love, which kicks the tempo up considerably from the last track. Love the heavy groove riff throughout and the solid group vocals, the latter of which not too dissimilar from some of the better Aerosmith of the era. The soloing styles could have easily influenced not only the Nawabum bands, but maybe also some of the hair metal bands of the 1980s, notably the Second Wave, who were also a bit into Aerosmith. Flipping over to side 2, we get Highway Lady, which has an almost Who-like opening with chords and keys hitting us right away, but quickly switches over to a classy boogie sound and maybe some nods to older rock and roll as well. Next is On With the Action, a bit of a slow burner that reminds me of what would later come from Dio-era Sabbath, with some of their more ponderous tracks out there. Similar guitar vibes, but with the vocals being bluesier, more soulful. Really like this one. After that, we get A Fool in Love, which is a cover song originally done the year before from the Frankie Miller Band, which brings in some boogie as well as some heavy but bluesy guitar accents. Guitar tone and style, especially for the soloing, gives me some strong Ace Frehley vibes. The album closes with Martian Landscape, another spacey album closer, as we also got from Forcet. A little bit of Bowie in here for sure, but also some moments of boogie and blues with some heavier moments beginning about mid-track, notably from Schenker, which really shouldn't be a surprise at this point. Spaciness is definitely coming from the synth keys, which in more upbeat passages switches over to piano. Definitely has a big sound towards the end with some Queen-like harmonic soloing taking us out. Very much an end-of-album type of song. Favorites are Natural Thing, Reasons Love, and On With the Action. As for charting, it reached 169 in the US and 38 in Sweden. Also, no certifications. And also Can You Roll Her and Highway Lady were the singles. As with before, Leo Lyons was the producer and Hypnosis did the album cover. Also, the Nawabum band Heavy Pettin' actually took their name from the title of this very album. So we're definitely hearing a lot more keyboards, both piano and synth in this one, likely because of the addition of keyboardist Danny Peronell, for whom this was his only UFO album. But the heaviness is still here and keys aren't as front and center as the guitar, though when they briefly are, you can definitely hear a little bit of John Lord of Deep Purple in them. Plenty of Schenker guitar magic throughout, so no worries there. I like the record more than Phenomenon, but slightly less than Forcet. Next is their sixth studio album, released in May of 1977 by Chrysalis Records. This is Lights Out. So a steady rocking beat and chord-heavy riff takes us through the opening track, Too Hot to Handle, which has a bit of swagger and mid-pace boogie to it. Love the heavier bridge leading into the solo in this one. After that, we get Just Another Suicide, a laid-back song with some background acoustic and keys underneath, a strumming riff and some lead accents throughout. Decent track, but it seems too early in the album for a slower tune. Next is Try Me, and everything slows down even more with this ballad, with violin strains and romantic piano passages. And this is where I'm wondering if the record is gonna pick up, because it's fairly unbalanced so far, with this track being far more suited as an album ender, if needing to be here at all. But then we get the title track, and it picks things up considerably with its gallop-heavy riffing and more aggressive vocals, not to mention some very cool guitar accents and overall heavy solo work. Also, very catchy chorus. I gotta say, this is the UFO I want to hear, and I'm hoping we get a lot more of this on the record going forward. In fact, this would have made a much better album opener. After that is Getting Ready, and things get a bit mellower again, but overall mid-pace and melodic, with those signature guitar bits briefly tossed in at times. It's fine, but not really blowing me away. Next is their cover of Alone Again Or, originally done by Love back in 1968, and it clearly sounds like a cover tune, not really fitting in with the rest of the material. But Schenker does get to partake in some cool layered solo work amidst the orchestral strings, so that's something. Next is Electric Phase, which has a nice heavy groove to it with slight hints of Zeppelin. This track once again brings the record up a bit from what is clearly an otherwise mellower effort, and it's a welcome break from all of that. Also, some of the best solo work on the album. The record ends with the epic length track Love to Love, starting with isolated solo wails, bass accents, eerie keys, and an almost menacing slowness to it. But then it shifts into a pulsating and crunching riff, accented by a fitting acoustic passage, followed by a severe drop to mellow verse parts. Then it moves between the mellow and heavy parts going forward. It's nearly 8 minutes long, and now that I've heard it, it makes more sense to end the record with this. I think I would have preferred that. Not a perfect song, but it definitely has some really cool moments. Favorites are Lights Out, Electric Phase, and Love to Love. As for charting, it reached 23 in the US, 54 in the UK, and 31 in Sweden. Also, no certifications. And also, Alone Again Or, Too Hot to Handle, and Try Me were the singles. Also, in a 2013 interview, Steve Harris of Iron Maiden called the track Love to Love his favorite song, and you can definitely hear what Steve liked about it, notably the bass parts and how that might have made its way into his own playing in Iron Maiden. As for covers, Fifth Angel covered Lights Out on their Time Will Tell album from 1989. Reverend covered the same track on the Spaced Out, a UFO tribute compilation album in 2004. And Stryper covered it on their The Covering album in 2011. So I dig the album, some in more parts than others, but I thought I'd like it a lot more than I did, given it's a fan favorite, how high it charted, and how well known this band is for the album's title track. Again, I dig it, but maybe not as much as the previous two albums. Next up is their 7th studio album, released in June of 1978 by Chrysalis Records. This is Obsession. So, album opens with Only You Can Rock Me, with an infectious riff, background keys, and rock vocals, both on their own and of the gang variety as well. A wee bit anthemic to be sure, notably with its catchy chorus. It also has some big sounding moments, especially when the solo kicks in. Next is the heavier and funkier Pack It Up and Go, with some seriously heavy lead accents, riffs for days, and a real drive to it. Killer song with a lot of heft. Next is Arbory Hill, bringing in an acoustic passage, accompanied by Schenker playing the recorder. Yes, the recorder. But it's a brief instrumental, clocking in at a little over a minute, so it doesn't necessarily overstay its welcome. It's fine. After that is Ain't No Baby, which starts slow with guitar wails and slow bass notes, but kicks in quickly enough with some swagger and a little bit of the Aerosmith coming in, making way for more dramatic choruses. Schenker's riffing gets a bit bluesier here, but really kicks into full gear during the final minute of the track. Up next is Looking Out for Number 1, which drops down to ballad mode with a sad piano passage alongside intermittent strings and some electric guitar underneath. I'm more or less good with it, but I'm also glad it comes later into the record as opposed to what happened on Lights Out. One thing I did notice with some of these comparatively sappier slow tracks from UFO is that Schenker's guitar work often rescues these songs, and it's kind of a pattern I'm seeing throughout the discography so far. Maybe you've noticed it as well. Anyways, after that, we get Hot and Ready, which picks it up to mid-pace with a swingy riff style and some stronger vocals overall. And here's where I'm hearing more solo tones skittering into Fraley territory again. Shaker does play with various guitar sounds, as I've discovered throughout these albums, so should be surprised if he changes things up here and there in that regard. Anyways, up next is Cherry, which moves between mellow and rocking in equal measure. Kind of dig the guitar layering in this one, not to mention the vocal performance from Moog. It also has a bit of a vibe reminiscent of what we'd later hear in 90s alt-rock bands, so that's kind of interesting. After this is You Don't Fool Me, a steady rocker with some stomp and punch, also some killer solo work ripping over the top of that stomp. Moog's vocals are still very strong from the last track going into this one, giving us a nice 2-track run of solid singing. Next is Looking Out for Number 1, Reprise, which is another short but playful instrumental, and a nice little excuse for more Schenker, but this time with some Queen-like harmonizing. Pretty cool. After this is One More for the Rodeo with some more stomp as well as soulful vocals and bluesier Schenker guitar lines. Has an almost Bad Company smack to it in parts, and it definitely kicks. Overall, solid rocker. The album ends with the track Born to Lose, which is a slow and sentimental rocker with almost spacey acoustic playing, some subtle strings in the back, and of course guitar accents weaving in and out. Really loving when the building solo work begins about mid-track, ramping up as it goes, and then makes way for the mellow ending chorus. Favorites on this record are Pack It Up and Go, Hot and Ready, and You Don't Fool Me. As for charting, it reached 41 in the US, 31 in Sweden, 68 in Canada, 89 in Australia, and the highest of all in the UK at 26. Also, no certifications. And also, Cherry, Only You Can Rock Me, and Born to Love were the singles. This was also the final studio album for Michael Schenker before he left for a solo career, and came back in 1995 for a few albums, and then again went off to do more solo work. Also, the cover was again done by Hypnosis, in case that's not really obvious at this point. I mean, look at it. As for cover tunes, Riot covered Only You Can Rock Me on their Through the Storm album in 2002, and John Corabi covered the song on the Lights Out, the Ultimate Tribute to UFO compilation album in 2007. So a mixed bag record with a much stronger side 2, which is where you get a lot more of Schenker's solid riffs and solos, not to mention more of the heaviness. Of course, Pack It Up and Go from side 1 is no slouch either. It's a listenable album with some peaks and valleys in terms of quality, admittedly. Overall, I liked it more than Lights Out, but not by leaps and bounds. Next is their 8th studio album, released in January of 1980 by Chrysalis Records. This is No Place to Run. So the record opens with Alpha Centauri, a spacey guitar instrumental at about 2 minutes with some eerie keys and almost menacing background beat. This de facto intro track brings us straight into Lettin' Go, and it's a mid-paced melodic rocking track that would be right at home on an early Fastway album, or even skittering into Nawabum territory at times. The main riff definitely reminds me of what we'd get from early Def Leppard, not to mention the solos are full of ripping energy. Dig this track for sure. Next is Mystery Train, which begins as an acoustic blues number, but quickly kicks into high energy as a metallic blues romp. Think a much heavier Aerosmith meets early 80s Diamond Head. Next is This Fire Burns Tonight, a slower rock track with a pulsating backbeat and strumming riffs. It's fine, but lacks a bit of energy. After this is Gone in the Night with its slow groove leading into a piano passage and solo vocals for the verses, which has a bit of Elton John vibes, strangely enough. Choruses are stronger than the rest, with some nice interplay between bass and guitar. Track ends with some shred soloing, but not enough of that in this song for my liking. Next up is Young Blood. It's an anemic track with bluesy vocals and ringing chords that also has a fairly generic rock riff for the time. Kind of sounds like the Swede on Quaaludes. After that is No Place to Run, which has a nice gallop verse riff a la Def Leppard, not to mention an overall darkish tone to it. Best song I've heard on this record, and we only have 2 more to go, so I'm not entirely hopeful here. Next is Take It or Leave It, and it's an acoustic guitar and piano ballad, and effective as such, but also a bit formulaic, as we've heard these bluesy ballads from them before, and done more interestingly. After this is Money Money, and I know it's a future reference, but I could easily hear this song being played by The Darkness with its head-nodding groove, pop rock riffing, and similar crooning style. For what it is, it's a decent track, but doesn't measure up to the best of what I've heard from this band on previous records. The album ends with Any Day, which opens with some eerie reverbed bass and spacey vocals, and I'm digging the vocal melody here for sure. It then kicks into pure rock riffing and energetic singing, alongside some killer ripping solo work. Then back to the spacey bits, then to the rockin' bits, and so on. It's a really oddball track, but it's strong in its mood and gusto, so it's a solid way to end up an otherwise up and down record. Favorites are Lettin' Go, No Place to Run, and Any Day. As for charting and certification, it reached 51 in the US, 44 in Sweden, 33 in Norway, 91 in Canada, and highest of all in the UK, of course, at number 11. Also, it went silver in the UK, the only UFO album to ever certify. Also, Young Blood and Lettin' Go were the singles. Also, after a 2-album run with producer Ron Nevison, the band enlisted the help of famed Beatles producer George Martin for this record. Production is a little flat at times, but I'm also thinking this band could have went with a producer who could have brought more punch into the proceedings. I'm thinking maybe Ted Templeman, or perhaps more relevantly, Jack Douglas when thinking of the Aerosmith connection. Granted, the production isn't bad, but could have used more heft overall. So, no Michael Schenker, but Paul Chapman is hardly sleeping at the wheel here, bringing in a wealth of solid riffs and ripping solos, though I do wish it was more of that. Ultimately, I feel Schenker's presence is missing on this one, leaving much of the writing to Mogg and Way, who do a respectable job, to be fair. So again, mixed bag on this one. Next up is their 9th studio album, released January 16th, 1981 by Chrysalis Records. This is The Wild, The Willing, and The Innocent. So opening track Chains, Chains doubles down on the blues rock and keeps the heavy stomp going, but with rougher vocals than usual. Chorus is particularly poppy, but also catchy, and this is where I might bring the Def Leppard comparisons back, at least a little bit. It kind of makes sense. I mean, UFO is a big influence on Def Leppard. Anyway, soloing on this track is a bit more sedate and already getting a safer sound than before, which I hope doesn't continue. Next is Long Gone with a mellow acoustic and quiet vocal opening, but soon enough kicks in with a solid steady riff, some cool gang vocals, and a killer solo. I could do without the string section taking us out, but it's not a deal breaker either. Overall, much better than the last song, and would love this record to go more into this direction. But you know what? We'll see how that goes. After this, we get the title track with a melodic acoustic symphonic intro, perhaps connecting it to the end of the last track, and then abandons that for a wailing rock riff and punchy vocals. Love the guitar tone and pulsing bass here. Super heavy, notably in the verse lines because it does get a little pop towards the choruses. Still very catchy and very listenable. Next is It's Killing Me with a slow fade-up riff and bass line, leading to moaning solo work and smooth vocals. Bit of a slow boogie here with musical shades of Tom Petty in the verses, but heavies up in the simple choruses, which is to say that I love the choruses more, but it's a largely decent track. After this is Makin' Moves, and it's now clear that UFO loves to start many songs slow and then punch in later. This is a prime example of that, though the punch is strong with this one, noting the almost Judas Priest guitar tone and riffing here, albeit in their bluesier end of things. I dig it. Next is Lonely Heart, which, as you can imagine, starts out in a slow piano ballad mood, but then ramps up with up-tempo rock riffing, much as you would hear from a host of radio rock bands in the early 1980s, such as Journey, Triumph, and Boston, but then ends with a bit of saxophone. I don't know, it's fine. After that is Couldn't Get It Right, and UFO is definitely joining the 1980s here with hand claps, staple vocal melodies, and radio rock riffing of the time. The album ends with a ballad, Profession of Violence, which is an interesting name for a ballad. We get the familiar piano, strings, and acoustic guitar routine here, but I have to say it's a seriously decent track for what it is. The vocal performance is likely the strongest part of the song, with some solid melody and overall delivery. Love the melancholic solo work on this one as well, though it might be fair to say that it sounds like a bit of Schenker emulation. Still, it's pretty good, so I don't really care. And it's an effective album closer, so bonus. Anyways, favorites of this one are Long Gone, Makin' Moves, and Profession of Violence. As for charting, it reached 77 in the US, 27 in Sweden, and 19 in the UK. Also, no certifications. And also, Couldn't Get It Right and Lonely Heart were the singles. As for cover tunes, I could only find one. It seems that Metallica covered It's Killing Me live in December of 2022 for their Helping Hands charity show. So, Paul Chapman is writing a lot more material on this record than the last one for sure. Also, this album was self-produced, perhaps not being satisfied with where the last couple of producers took them, sonically speaking. It's certainly a catchier album than the last couple, and the heaviness is trying to come back at least a little more, though it's also very radio-friendly throughout, in case that's a concern. Despite that, it's a more or less likable album, but doesn't blow my socks off either. Next is their 10th studio album released in February of 1982 by Chrysalis Records. This is Mechanics. So we start things off with the writer with some heavy riffing and background synth effects, and then not so background when they share solo time with guitar and saxophone, and right away we're hearing a less focused UFO. If they had just stuck with the riffs and left out the synth and sax, it would have been a better song, but it does suffer from the inclusions. Big time. After this is the cover song, Something Else, originally done by Eddie Cochran, and this almost feels like a low-rent cross between 80s Cheap Trick and the Stray Cats. Even the big guitar chords are drowned out by the synth and sax. It's pretty bad and goofy and doesn't fit. So, 0 for 2 so far. Next is Back Into My Life, which is an acoustic ballad with occasional up-tempo moments. They've done this before, and while it's listenable, it's also very familiar and very predictable. After that is You'll Get Love, which has a bit of swagger and funk, and by comparison to the previous tracks, this is noticeably better and sounds a lot more like UFO. Has a sort of pre-1987 Whitesnake vibe to it. Next is Doing It All For You, a bit of a slow burner that picks up the pace a little and then competently rocks, but then slows way down for the choruses. It's decent, but not amazing. After this is We Belong to the Night, which fades up a flanged out riff, going straight into a driving beat and riff combo that finally injects some real energy into this record. This would have made a killer Fastway song had Pete Way taken it with him when he left UFO, and I feel Dave King's vocals would have been even better here. Next is Let It Rain, which has some cool and heavy riff moments amidst an otherwise pop rock tune, but the chorus is so saccharine and generic that it brings the song down quite a bit. Still, some good ideas here, but they simply don't dominate. After this is Terry, and as you could guess by the title, it's a ballad about a girl. Honestly, it wouldn't have been out of place on the album of any bottom-tier one-hit wonder hair metal band of the later 1980s, indistinguishable from all those other bland ballads they put out. Anyways, next is Feel It, and while it's a serviceable blues rocker, it doesn't stand out at all. It's fine, but not much more than that. The album ends with Dreaming, an upbeat rock track that is likely one of the strongest on the record. The riffs are solid, vocal delivery is likewise punchy, and it's a catchy track to boot. Strong ender to a not-so-strong album. Favorites are You'll Get Love, We Belong to the Night, and Dreaming. As for charting, it reached 82 in the US, 38 in Sweden, and number 8 in the UK. Also, as you can imagine, no certifications. And also, Let It Rain and Back Into My Life were the singles. So, if you jettison the first 3 songs and go back to the heavier musical strategies from older albums, this could have been saved, but it just feels like the 3 favorite songs I picked are just surrounded by mediocrity and even some tragically bad ideas. So, I get why Pete Way left after this. But I also agree with some of the band that while this isn't a strong record, it does have a few shining moments. Just not enough of them. So here's my album ranking. I would definitely say that the 2 albums that are closest to metal without technically being metal are Force It and No Heavy Petting, though largely for Shanker's guitar work, let's be honest. Because of Shanker, I would recommend his work on Obsession and Lights Out as well. And while UFO is clearly not a metal band, they were certainly heavy enough at times to merit the attention of metal fans, largely older ones, like me. And I gotta say, I really get the hype behind Michael Shanker now. As I showed before, I have his 80s solo albums, and they're good for what they are, but he truly shined during his time in UFO, and that's pretty obvious to me now. And to others as well, including a lot of metal guitar players who were inspired specifically by Michael Shanker-era UFO. Again, Michael Denner, but also Kirk Hammett, James Hetfield, Dave Mustaine, Marty Friedman, Dimebag Darrell, Alex Skolnick, Gary Holt, Adrian Smith, Randy Rhoads, Jeff Waters, and Kerry King, among others. I mean, Mustaine even told an interviewer for Blabbermouth that the reason he plays a flying V at all is Michael Shanker. Anyways, let's answer the usual question, and that's, do I consider this band contributive to heavy metal? Well, I think it's fair to say that Michael Shanker really is the key to any sort of bridge between UFO and the metal bands to come. I also mentioned the new wave of British heavy metal period earlier, and it's no secret that many of those bands gained a lot of inspiration from 70s UFO as well. Overall, there is plenty of evidence to support the idea that UFO had a profound impact on metal in the 1980s and to some degree beyond. Of course, feel free to let me know what you think about this band and their albums, whether I mention the albums or not. And if you're feeling particularly generous, let me also know what bands you think I should look at next in this series. I'm largely pointing for the 1970s, maybe the latter half of the 1960s as well, just to give you a bit of a guideline. So yeah, let me know all of that and anything else relevant in the comments below. And of course, if this is your first time to my channel and you wonder what else I do, my name is Matt. This is the Accusation Network, where each and every week I do videos on metal vinyl collecting, but also classic and modern metal in general. If you like that idea and you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, I'd super appreciate it if you did. Likewise, like this video and share it out with some of your friends on social media. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.